how much do these incredibly large language models actually know? I mean, versus how much are they just remembering specific stuff they saw during training?
It's a huge question.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about the scale.
Exactly. You've got a model, maybe 8 billion parameters, right? Sounds like a lot. Maybe 30, 32 gigs of storage.
Yeah.
But then it's trained on something like 15 trillion tokens of text. That's what, 7 terabytes?
It's a staggering difference. How does all that data get, well, squished down? And what sticks?
Right. Is it really learning general rules, generalizing, or is it just spitting back variations of what it memorized?
And figuring that out is fundamental. When an LM gives you an answer, where did that come from? Learned pattern or near duplicate recall?
This whole tension, generalization versus memorization, it matters for everything, doesn't it? Privacy, copyright, just basic trust in the output.
Absolutely. And for a long time, just measuring this split has been, well, really tough.
Which brings us to the research we're looking at today.
Exactly. This paper, How Much Do Language Models Memorize? It's from researchers across Meta, Google, DeepMind, Cornell, NVIDIA. They're offering a pretty new angle on how to quantify this.
Okay, let's do the deep dive then. Our mission today, unpack this paper. We want to understand their definitions, their measurements, what it says about model capacity.
And crucially, what it all means for the future of AI, how we build them, how we use them.
And a key thing they do right up front is trying to separate what they call unintended memorization
The stuff tied only to the specific training data.
from generalization, which is the info about the actual, underlying ways data gets generated in the world, like the rules of language.
Yeah, they argue you really need to pull those two apart to understand what's going on.
So before this paper, how did people try to measure this stuff? What were the old approaches?
Well, it mostly came down to two main things, extraction and membership inference.
Okay, extraction sounds like what it is. Trying to get the model to repeat training data.
Yeah, basically prompting it in ways you hope will trigger it to spit out exact sequences it saw. And membership inference, or MI, was more about building a classifier or test to guess if a specific piece of data was in the training set or not.
Gotcha. And why weren't those methods, the whole story? What were the problems?
Well, take extraction. Just because a model can generate something doesn't mean it's strictly memorized it in the way we might think.
How so?
Think about asking a model a complex math problem. It might give you the right answer, even if it never saw that exact problem.
Right, because it learned the rules of math. It's calculating, not just looking it up.
Exactly, it generalized. And people found you could sometimes prompt models cleverly to produce things that look like training data, but were actually synthesized through generalization. There was even some interesting work, Lewitt et al., I think, showing some things flagged as memorized weren't actually verbatim in the training set.
So extraction alone isn't proof of harmful memorization. What about the more formal definitions people used, like from privacy research?
Things like differential privacy or influence functions. They're powerful, but they tend to focus on the properties of the training algorithm, or maybe the data distribution overall.
Not on the specific model you ended up with.
Right. They weren't really designed to say, for this trained model right here, how much does it remember about this specific data point? We needed something more granular tied to the actual model artifact.
Okay, so the old ways were maybe too blunt or not quite asking the right question about individual model memory. This paper's approach is different then, based on compression.
Yes, that's the core idea. They propose defining memorization using concepts from information theory, specifically compression.
Like zip files, how does that connect?
It's a useful analogy. Think about it like this. If a model already contains information about some input data X, then that data X becomes more predictable given the model.
Okay.
And if something is more predictable, you need less new information, fewer bits to describe or encode it. The model essentially helps you compress the representation of X.
Ah, I see. So if the model remembers something about X, describing X takes less effort, informationally speaking, because the model gives you a head start.
Exactly. And they use this idea really cleverly to separate out the types of information. They define MEMU, that's unintended memorization.
The U for unintended.
Right. It's the information the model has specifically about the training data set it saw beyond what you'd expect from general knowledge. Then there's MEMI, the generalization.
The I for intended or inherent.
They link it to information about the true data generating process. So the general rules of language, facts about the world, stuff it should learn.
So MEMU is remembering the specifics from training. MEMI is learning the general rules. How do they actually measure the MEMU part in practice using this compression idea?
They look at the model's likelihood assigned to a data point X. Basically, how probable does the model think this sequence is? Higher likelihood means less surprise, which means better compression.
Okay.
Then they compare two scenarios. First, how well can you compress X using only the trained model little Fay hat? Second, how well can you compress X using the trained model plus a general purpose reference model, let's call it MEM, which represents broad background knowledge.
So comparing compression with just the specific model versus the specific model plus general knowledge.
Exactly. The difference in the compression achieved in those two scenarios is what they link to MEMU. It's the extra compression benefit you get purely from the specific training the model received beyond general world knowledge.
Yeah, that feels neat. It isolates the value added just by seeing that specific training data, much more precise than just trying to extract strings.
It is, and it gives them a handle on measuring something really fundamental. And this framework allows them to do something else super interesting. Estimate the total information capacity of the model architecture itself.
Capacity, you mean like how many actual bits of information can these parameters hold?
Precisely that. How much raw storage is there? They figure this out by measuring MEMU on data where generalization is impossible, basically, random bit strings.
Random data, because there are no underlying patterns to learn, right?
Exactly. If the model manages to compress random data effectively, it must be by memorizing the specific arbitrary patterns in that random sequence. By seeing the limit of how much random data it can effectively compress, they estimate its total capacity.
Okay, the big reveal then. What capacity did they find for these GPT-style transformer models?
This is a really key number from the paper. They estimate the capacity is around 3.6 bits per parameter.
3.6 bits per parameter. Wow, that puts a concrete number on it. What does that tell us?
It gives us a much better sense of the information density. Some earlier estimates were maybe closer to 2 bits per parameter. This 3.6 suggests parameters might be, well, pretty efficient carriers of information.
More efficient than maybe we thought.
Potentially. And they did this fascinating check too. They trained models using higher precision numbers for the weights like float 32 instead of the usual B float 16.
So using twice the numerical bits per parameter.
Right, but the measured capacity, it only went up slightly, from about 3.51 bits per parameter to 3.83.
Huh. So doubling the numerical precision doesn't double the information storage capacity.
It seems not. Which implies those extra bits in higher precision aren't primarily about just cramming more specific memories in. Maybe they're more for numerical stability or allowing finer distinctions in the learned patterns, the generalized stuff. Big implications for model design.
Okay, so that's capacity from random data. What happened when they applied this whole compression framework to real text, like the fine web data set? This is where generalization is possible, right?
Yeah, and this is where you see the real interplay. They measured MEMU on text. And as you might guess, MEMU generally increases with model size. Bigger models can hold more specifics.
Makes sense.
But, and this is crucial, they found MEMU decreases as the training data set gets bigger relative to the model's size.
Wait, more data leads to less specific memorization? That seems backwards.
It does initially, but this finding connects directly to things researchers have seen, like grokking, where a model suddenly gets much better late in training. The paper's interpretation, using their MEMU measure, is that models might initially rely heavily on memorizing specific examples. But as the dataset grows and grows, eventually it becomes larger than the model's total capacity to store everything individually.
It runs out of room to just memorize.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And at that point, the model is sort of forced to find a more efficient strategy.
Which is generalization.
Exactly. Learning the underlying rules becomes more space efficient than trying to remember every single example. So, as it's forced to generalize to cope with the data volume, the amount of unintended specific memorization, MEMU, actually starts to go down relative to the useful generalized knowledge, MEMI.
So generalization is like the model's space-saving technique once brute force memorization isn't feasible anymore.
That's a great way to put it. And they found this capacity threshold ties directly into another known effect.
Double descent.
Right, where performance sometimes gets worse for a bit as you scale up models or data before getting better again. Yeah. They showed that this dip in performance happens right around the point where the dataset size exceeds the model's estimated capacity.
Wow, so capacity limitation could be why double descent happens.
Their argument is compelling. That dip might be the model struggling as its memorization strategy fails under the data load, right before it figures out how to switch effectively to generalization. It connects capacity directly to these complex training dynamics.
That's fascinating. Okay, what about just raw extraction on real text? Did that behave differently?
They looked at that too. On large, diverse, deduplicated datasets like FineWeb, they found that while extraction rates on training data do decrease as the dataset grows, they don't actually hit zero.
But
The rate converges. The success rate for extracting sequences from the training set ends up being basically the same as the success rate for extracting similar sequences from the unseen test set.
hold on, so if you can extract something, it's just as likely to be something the model could generate anyway, even if it wasn't in the training data.
That's the implication. On these big, diverse data sets, successful extraction might often be a sign of good generalization rather than specific, problematic memorization. The model has learned patterns so well that it can generate sequences common enough to appear in both training and test.
That really changes the interpretation of extraction tests, especially for privacy concerns. If training and test extraction look the same,
It suggests the model isn't necessarily leaking unique training secrets just because you extracted something plausible, which links back to the security side and membership inference.
right, was this specific data point used for training?
Yeah. They use their framework to look at MI on text data too. They confirmed, as others have found, that MI gets harder as the data set size increases. It's generally easier than extraction, though you might detect influence even if you can't extract.
But still gets harder with more data.
Yes, especially for average data points. But they went further and developed a scaling law for MI. A formula predicting the MI success rate, measured by F1 score, based on the model's capacity and the dataset size. It showed this relationship where MI accuracy is high for small datasets, but drops off significantly as the dataset gets huge relative to capacity.
Did they check if this formula actually works?
They did. They tested it against results from larger GPT-2 models, 125 million and 1.5 billion parameters, and found the formula's predictions were pretty accurate, within about 1.5 F1 points.
Okay, so what does this validated scaling law predict for the kinds of massive models we train today on trillions of tokens?
This is a really important prediction. The law suggests that for models trained with these very high token to parameter ratios, say 100 tokens per parameter or more, which is common now, the average MI F1 score should hover around 0.5.
0.5. That's just random chance, isn't it? Like flipping a coin.
Exactly. It implies that for the vast majority of typical data points in these enormous training sets, reliably determining if they were part of the training data just based on the model's loss or likelihood might be fundamentally impossible.
So for the average piece of text, MI attacks might just fail.
That's the strong suggestion. Now, this doesn't mean MI is impossible for every single data point, but for the bulk of the data, it becomes extremely difficult, potentially offering a kind of implicit privacy for typical inputs.
Okay, so average stuff seems hard to pin down, but you said MI isn't impossible for all points. Did they figure out which kinds of data points do get memorized, even when the average MI is low?
They did. They looked specifically at the data points from the text data set that had high MEMU, the ones showing strong signs of unintended memorization. And they correlated this with a measure called TF-IDF.
TF-IDF, term frequency inverse document frequency. That measures how uniquely important a word is to a document compared to the whole data set, right? High TF-IDF means rare terms.
That's it. And they found a really strong correlation. Data points with high TF-IDF scores were significantly more likely to be the ones with high MEMU, the ones being unintentionally memorized.
So the model tends to specifically memorize the weird stuff, the outliers.
Pretty much. The stuff that's unique or rare in the data set. They gave examples highly memorized sequences often had rare words, or were snippets of non-English languages like Japanese, Chinese, Hebrew, Greek, which were probably very uncommon in the largely English FineWeb data they used.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. If a sequence is totally unlike the general patterns the model is learning,
it can't easily generalize it, doesn't fit the rules it's discovering, so the fallback seems to be just storing that specific anomalous sequence.
It defaults to memorization for the exceptions because they don't fit the general rules it's building.
Exactly, and that tells us a lot about what kind of specific information is most likely to persist from the training data. It's the unusual bits.
This research really does provide a much clearer picture. Now, the paper does mention limitations, right?
Of course. They're careful to note that their specific results come from their experimental setup. specific architectures, datasets, training methods. The exact numbers, like the 3.6 bits parameter, might shift a bit with different configurations.
And the capacity is a lower bound.
Right, they state it's a lower bound. It's possible models could potentially store slightly more under different conditions, but it gives us a solid baseline.
Still, the overall framework and the main findings seem incredibly powerful for understanding these systems better.
Oh, absolutely. It feels like a really foundational contribution.
Okay, so let's bring it back to our mission. We wanted to understand memorization, capacity, and the implications. What are the big takeaways for us, for anyone thinking about AI's future?
Well, first, we now have a way to quantify memorization using compression, and crucially, to separate that unintended recall, MEMU, from useful generalization, MEMI. That's huge.
Second, that concrete number for capacity, around 3.6 bits per parameter for these transformers, gives us a sense of the fundamental information density.
Third, understanding this capacity limit helps explain complex training dynamics like double descent and grokking. It shows generalization isn't just magic, it's partly driven by the model hitting its storage limits and needing a more efficient strategy.
Right. And fourth, on the privacy security front, the prediction that for average data in massive data sets, membership inference based on model likelihood becomes incredibly hard, essentially random guessing.
And this is the fifth key point, the data that is most likely to be specifically memorized tends to be the rare, unique, high TF, IDF content, the outliers.
So putting that all together, what does it mean for actually building and using AI going forward?
It has major implications. Knowing the capacity informs architectural choices and scaling strategies. Understanding the trade-off between memorization and generalization helps us tailor training, maybe adjusting data size versus model size to encourage generalization, or being aware of when memorization is likely.
And for privacy.
It suggests maybe we should focus less on the theoretical risk of leaking average data points via simple MI, and more on identifying and handling the unique data points that are more vulnerable to being specifically memorized and potentially revealed.
Yeah.
It guides data curation and maybe even techniques to make unique data less memorizable.
It just gives us a much more rigorous quantitative handle on what these models are actually doing internally, moving beyond just intuition.
Exactly, which is critical if we want to build AI that's not just powerful, but also more predictable, reliable, and trustworthy.
Okay, so here's a final thought to leave you mulling over, something that builds on this. If we accept that these large models primarily generalize the common stuff, but specifically memorize the rare, unique outlier stuff, what does that really tell us about the nature of the knowledge they hold? Is it like having a solid grasp of the everyday world, but with these scattered, vivid, almost photographic memories of the truly bizarre things encountered? And how should that change what we expect them to reliably know or recall about the specifics within their training data?
It certainly paints a more complex picture than just saying the model knows things. It has a lot of nuance.
Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into how AI remembers.
My pleasure. Fascinating stuff.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.